Hello and welcome to the Restless Theologian podcast, where we focus on having insightful conversations in biblical history and theology. I'm your host, Zachariah Ishak. For our first episode of Season 2, we will be discussing the humanity of Christ. And today I have with me my good friend Zach Hum. He's going to join in with me and kind of discuss this and just kind of dive deeper into the humanity of Christ in regards to his human emotions. So how you doing, Zach?
I'm doing great, Zach. Thanks for being here. Zach and Zach in the house.
I know. So I really appreciate you coming on. I know that you haven't been on a podcast before and a little hesitant about it. I think a lot of people are. You know, it is actually a lot more difficult to get people to be on. I think that, same goes for me about the whole, you can be a little bit self-conscious, and it's just how it is, and it takes a little bit of practice, and I still feel like it's a little bit outside my comfort zone. But
I've been praying for opportunities to honor him in new ways, and this opportunity presented itself. So I guess I just need to be obedient and try my best. So here we go. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great to hear. So I wanted to talk about how with Jesus' humanity, there's a couple of different things I want to touch on. I want to touch on the titles that he has that kind of declare him to, have a human nature, and also the human emotions that he expressed. Because I feel like a lot of times what we can do is focus so much on the deity of Christ. And I think that kind of studying this subject, it was very apparent very quickly that a lot of heresy and a lot of errors early on in the church were a lot of times related to the deity or the humanity of Christ. So when I'm talking about the humanity of Christ, I'm talking explicitly about his human nature, his human emotions, the fact that he had a physical body and a rational soul. And there's some titles in Scripture that are repeated, such as the Son of Man, which is Christ. It's his favorite self-designation.
Right.
It's what he says the most, what he calls himself the most. And I think that that's very interesting that he does that. And the other one's the seed of the woman. In Genesis 3:15, it talks about the seed of the woman that will crush the head of the serpent. Mm-hmm. And then also the son of David. And I didn't really think about, I'm aware of that one, but I didn't really think about how much in the Gospels that people call him the son of David.
Right.
And I think that that's really cool too. So out of those three titles, which one kind of stands out to you as in what just about his personhood, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, if we start with the Son of Man, that's kind of the most obvious and the easiest to relate to, as we are man. So just thinking about how he's expressing himself and the emotions that he's either outwardly showing or imply internally, I think those are the connections that we as humans can make with him, and understand that feeling things aren't necessarily a bad thing, that there's a divine nature to some of our emotions, and being able for us to relate to his human experience and understanding how those same emotions affected him can help lead us to, position ourselves to follow in his footsteps. So, yeah.
So I know that you read and, did you read or listen to B.B. Warfield's On the Emotional Life of Our Lord? That was kind of for a short read, it was dense.
Yeah, I did a little bit of both. So I read it and then I listened to it on YouTube. There's a couple of great sources out there to check out where it's publicly available. I highly recommend just giving it a listen after this. I process information differently when I read versus when I hear, and I was listening on the way here. And it's just, one of the things that stood out was how he talks about not just the emotions that were expressed, but the emotions that never showed up in the Bible too. So you can think about, there wasn't, never said that Jesus laughed, but there's an intrinsic joy in the way that he's portrayed, that you understand that it's that internal harnessing of kind of the same manifestation of emotion that really kind of stood out to me when I was reading it today. So,
yeah, there was like what's recorded for us in the Gospels are definitely the most vivid aspects of his emotions. And, obviously not every emotion was captured. Like you said, like there's no notation that he laughed. I would have to say that I would imagine by his tone, or not his, you can tell the tone that comes through when he's refuting the Pharisees and Sadducees. You can tell that there's almost a comic sort of comedic sarcasm to some of the stuff he says. You know what I mean? Like and I think this is another thing that this is something that me with my personality, I know that I'm one of those people that can be a little bit more of a blunt object, and I can be a little bit harsh. And I've over time gotten better with that. But, that was something of a struggle for me, is that sometimes other Christians would accuse me of like, well, that's not very Christ-like, you're being mean. Even if I didn't say necessarily insult somebody, if I showed some sort of sarcasm or just basically was a lot more blunt than they would have been, that I would have been accused of being unchristlike. But it's really, I like how in the scriptures that Jesus, it notes that he became indignant, or that he was irritated, or that he expressed his anger. For example, like when, in the temple and people are selling.
Right.
Yeah.
Flipping tables,
yeah. Making a whip. And a lot of times I feel like that's missed in our culture. And, he said some pretty harsh things about he called them, about the Pharisees and Sadducees. He called them hypocrites.
Right.
He called them serpents, sons of the devil. John the Baptist says similar things. He calls them brood of vipers. And then you even have Paul. He makes comments like that. So I'd be definitely challenging the person that says that just because you're a Christian, you can't make those kind of comments. I think sometimes they're warranted. I mean, I think that we should be judicial in when we express that. But I think it's kind of cool to see that, we don't have to be this emotionalist, anger-free type people all the time.
Right. When I think of that story in particular, it makes me think of the superhero's dilemma. So it's, that you're a superhero, you're literally fighting evil. Like there's a intrinsic thing where you have to break a few eggs to make a cake, right? Like you gotta do things that might not necessarily be perceived as holy necessarily, and understanding when the black and white reactions are appropriate, right? When it's okay to have that, divine anger almost, where it's inspired not from a selfish point of view, but because you're trying to bring greater good because of it, and just understanding when it's appropriate to express some of those harsher emotions or come off in that sort of way. Sometimes that's the appropriate way to react. And I think that's just a very interesting story, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. One of the other emotions that, B.B. Warfield, he kind of has the book split up in kind of three different categories. The first being compassion and love, the second being anger and indignation, and the third being joy and sorrow. And one of the things I've read was that Christ has a rational soul in which he expresses sorrow, and that sorrow isn't something that God expresses. God, like in his deity, doesn't express sorrow.
Right.
And I found that very fascinating. There's a couple of times where, the passage Jesus wept, supposedly I think the shortest verse in all the scriptures. And I was reading something, and it might have been actually in the B.B. Warfield book, but basically what he says was that it was actually not so much that Lazarus died, which that does make sense because it's like he knew he was going to resurrect him.
Right.
I mean, that was in his plan. But just the fact that sort of sorrow, that sort of pain, I mean, he felt it from other people. And I feel like he was very in tune to other people's feelings and their emotions. And just the fact that because of sin and because of the devil, that death became a reality to us.
Right.
And it almost like that that made him sorrowful and pity us.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting that you have to sometimes feel the pain to understand the joy, right?
Yeah.
So just knowing that there's opposites, and if you look at how he expressed himself throughout the Bible, it's kind of that middle ground, right? It's that had a little bit of temperance involved, where it's not always the extremes, one versus the other. A lot of his, since like we said earlier, like it didn't say that he expressed laughter, but there's still a way to convey joy without doing that. And it's just having that control and expressing, feeling the divine side of the emotion rather than the outward human side of the expression, I think is somewhat interesting too. Like having the compulsion as a human to outwardly express ourselves. Sometimes you can accomplish the same thing without being outwardly vocal about it. So,
yeah, since Christ was the perfect man,
mm-hmm.
and I think that when you look at the scriptures, you see that he expressed these emotions perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like he's the prime example of like, just when we look to what is a perfect man, we have his example before us about like even his like gentleness. One of the things that Warfield kind of hones in on is, I think one of the most frequently mentioned kind of emotions that Christ has a lot of times is pity and compassion.
Right.
And I did kind of love that, just because, Hebrews talks about that we don't have a great high priest that is unable to sympathize with us. He's able to sympathize with us because he's been tempted like us in every way. So I wanted to touch on a couple of the passages rather that focus in on his compassion. And you can tell that, throughout the scriptures, and especially the Gospels, just his concern for people's emotions, their sufferings emotionally, spiritually, and physically. So this is Matthew 9:36. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless like a sheep without a shepherd. Matthew 14:14. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. And this is the one that always gets me. Like, I've never really thought of myself as a very emotional guy. Like, it's just, I think a lot of times people, when they look at me, like I think like a lot of times in the past too, I think I just kind of have a stern look.
Yeah.
So if you don't know me, you don't know that, like, I could be a comical guy. Like, I think it's just, I think when people first meet me or just kind of see me for the first time or first interactions, they're unsure of what to make of me, just because. And I think it's, I don't know, I didn't grow up in an overly emotional household, and I wasn't very emotional myself. But I will say this though, that this passage, I always feel like there's, it's different for everybody, but so this is at the pool of Bethesda.
Mm-hmm.
And I really do love this story, but basically, and it's John 5:6-9. It says, one man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. And do you know the significance of the stirring of the water? You know what that was about?
No.
I think this is really cool. So I guess legend has it that the pool, I think at Bethesda, when it would get stirred up, that it was an angel that would stir it up. And any person who was in there first, after it was stirred up, was instantly healed of whatever affliction they were suffering from.
Mm-hmm.
And this poor guy, he was paralyzed, and when I hear the story, like I almost get emotional from it, just because he had no one to help him.
Yeah.
And then Christ comes and doesn't need to put him in the water. He's like, he just does it. And it just, the compassion he had on him. And a lot of times too, like people would come up to him and ask him, if you are willing, make me clean. And he says, I am willing, be cleansed. And I do love that about him, just because of that shows his gentleness and his willingness to heal those that come to him.
Mm-hmm. I think when I hear that story, I immediately visually see how it was portrayed in The Chosen, and just people crawling over each other trying to be healed, and just everybody serving themselves, right? There's this man who'd been there for so long and nobody had taken the time to just understand him, to try to help him, and just that one moment was enough for him to be healed. And I just think there's a lot of passion, just taking your time and just understanding people's situations and reaching out. Just a small gesture can be the thing that sets them on a new path. I think that's great.
Yeah. I actually haven't really watched the Chosen.
It's very well done. Is it
well done? Okay.
It's an interesting way to experience the Bible, for sure.
Yeah. I think, I do think that there are some, I do see some of this online where some Christians are a little bit leery of watching it, and it's a little bit more of, how accurate is it? And I haven't watched it, so I can't really pass judgment in any way. But I mean, I do love any sort of, movies. I do really love this audio Bible, Word of Promise. Have you ever heard it?
You had me download it. I have to check it out still.
Yeah. The Gospels are amazing. Going back to what you said about listening to On the Emotional Life of Our Lord, I was trying to listen to Gentle and Lowly. I'm trying to think who does it. It's Dane Ortland, I believe. But I was listening to it, and so far it was a good book. I'm maybe 35-40% of the way through it. But I can tell when I listen to something, when it's just one person, I have a tendency to start zoning out. But I think that's why the Word of Promise, when it comes to the Gospels, there's that back and forth. There's that interaction between characters. And I feel like that's what keeps me a little bit more
in The Chosen in particular, it's great because you do get to see a little bit more of the emotional nature of Christ, which is really interesting, their interpretation of it, because there is that joy and there is celebration and sorrow, and you really do get to see it on his face. And I think just as humans, being able to connect in that way kind of helps reframe some of the stories in a unique way. So definitely recommend checking it out.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to watch it. So I kind of wanted to dive deeper into kind of what I said earlier about the early heresies. And I brought these up. Let's see here. We have Catharism, and that was a little bit more of 1100s, and I think it might predate that. So the Cathars, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, I have no idea because I've never heard anyone else say it except me.
No, I believe that's correct.
So with Catharism, it's basically, there was a lot to their beliefs, but I think that there's two different gods. There's the one true God, the good God, and then there's an evil God. And I think that they think the God of Judaism was evil.
Okay.
And that they believe that the New Testament God was the good God, the righteous one. But they deny that Jesus had a physical body. So that would also mean that they deny a resurrection.
Right.
And which is fascinating because Jesus himself argues against the Sadducees who say there is no resurrection.
Right.
And so they believed him to be more of in the form of an angel, basically the appearance of a physical body only. And that's the same too of Docetism, that they believe that Jesus was fully divine and that he was more of a spiritual apparition.
Right.
And so you can already see early on that there's this tendency to separate or maybe magnify one of his natures over the other rather than them being in balance.
Right.
And there was also, too, the last one I wanted to bring up was adoptionism. Now, adoptionism is basically, from what I've gathered, it's non-Trinitarian, and that Jesus wasn't fully God until he was quote unquote adopted. So when he didn't become God until X, Y, or Z, or either he was at his baptism or maybe at his resurrection.
Okay.
Then he became fully God, but he wasn't fully God from the beginning.
Okay.
So that is a little bit more uncommon. I do think that there was maybe some possible expressions of it early on. I do know that the Seventh-day Adventists, some of them believe it. And then I think the only theologian that I kind of Googled and kind of found was John Stott. He was another one that helped. John Stott believed in annihilationism. We'll have to talk about that later. Sorry, I'm getting my terms confused.
Quite all right.
But there's a lot going on here. But so what do you think about the complexity of understanding his humanity and his divinity together? And I won't go too far down the path of his divinity because that'll be our next episode. But
yeah, I mean, as far as whether I agree with what they were thinking or not, I mean, it even says in the Bible that there's physical touch involved. So being a purely spiritual being, it doesn't really resonate with me at all. And
yeah,
I think part of the reason why he had to become human was to experience the pain that humans are feeling in order to understand, the suffering. Sometimes you have to go through those things in order to really understand them. It's coming from somebody who had to learn a lot of lessons the hard way, right? So I think just having the experience and being able to work your way through it makes you understand. And, you can talk to people about circumstances, but once you have gone through some of the difficulties that other people have, you really fully understand the effect that it can have on the human nature. So,
yeah. So going back to like what Hebrews says about him being able to sympathize with us because he was like us in every way except for sin.
Right.
And so he's able to sympathize with our weaknesses. And I think that's a great passage because God doesn't seem so distant. You know what I mean? He's close to us because he takes part in our human nature.
Right.
And
in all the extremes, right? So it's, my God, why have you forsaken me? Like it's all the way, it's to the point where it's just like desperation, the point of surrender, and, I think we've all been there to some extreme, and just being able to get into those sorts of depths of emotion, I think just there's a little bit of comfort in that, right? Like he does understand,
Yeah,
like,
he does understand.
It doesn't, the pain while you're going through it doesn't make sense, but there's beauty on the other side of it no matter what, right? So yeah.
And it's just the fact of his willingness to do it. He himself says, no one takes my life from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. He has the power to do it. No one could take it from him. He lays it down. And I wanted to touch on, so what you said kind of made me think of, so how there's like the duality in humanity and divinity of Christ, kind of like there's a duality in us because we have a human body, but we also have a soul. So it's like you have the physical and you have the spiritual kind of come together. We don't really understand it, all that much, but we do understand that it is a reality. It's what separates us from the animals. But one of the things I wanted to touch on was that, have you ever watched R.C. Sproul or listened to him? Do you know who he is?
No, I'm not familiar.
Okay. I really like R.C. Sproul. He was a Reformed Christian. He had died, I think, a few years back. But anyway, when I was watching one of his videos, he really kind of touches a lot on the passive obedience of Christ versus, I'm trying to think if I'm drawing a blank here. I guess whatever the opposite of passive is.
Be intentional, I guess, something like that. Right?
I'm sure it'll come to me. Active.
Active, right. Active. That makes sense. Yep.
So there's the active obedience of Christ. So it was really, I was brought up about how, if all Christ needed to do to save us was come down from heaven and die on the cross, that why didn't he just show up as a man, fully grown and then just go immediately to the cross. And he touches on how it is actually both are equally important, the active obedience of Christ versus the passive obedience. So when I mean active obedience, it was in his keeping of the law. So that would be, his baptism, that would be in his keeping of the commandments and, living a perfect and righteous life. And so that there's also the passive obedience of Christ, which means that, he emptied himself, which I think is the term like kenosis. I think it's comes from the Greek, but basically he emptied himself of his almost like his right to the divine in a sense. Not that he was no less divine, but that it was so apparent about his human nature when he walked here on earth, and that he completely was obedient to God the Father's will. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, sounds like he sheds tears and, he prays and then, he says, let not my will, but yours be done. But that's the great thing is, their wills are aligned. Right. So, but it's his perfect obedience to God. So, and I think that this is where we get a double imputation. And I won't go too deep into it, but double imputation basically is this, that he who knew no sin became sin that we might become the righteousness of God. So our sin is transferred to Christ. He bears our sin and he gives us his righteousness. So there's that transference there. And so that's why, and I know I've mentioned this before, Warfield kind of touches on it, but salvation by works. And it's it's Christ's work. So it's we're still under a works-based system. It's just that Christ accomplished the work perfectly in his righteousness, that his righteousness is transferred to us on our account, to our account.
Yeah. Love through action.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I just wanted to, briefly mention that. I it's crazy to me how much all of these doctrines touch one another. They're always interconnected, it seems.
Right. On so many levels too, which is just so great.
Yeah. So in studying this, I definitely started to learn some new terms.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And, that's the great thing about Christology is there's so much there. So there's this Latin term called, and I'm going to butcher it, communicatio idiomatum or communicatio idiomatum.
I'm looking at it. That sounds right.
I feel like, it's something from John Wick, excommunicado.
There you
go. Okay. So it's a Christological concept about the interaction of deity and humanity in the person of Jesus Christ. From what I gather, I don't think this is explicit to a specific denomination. I think what it's saying is that this is how it would be how Lutherans understand the divinity and humanity of Christ, how the Reformed understand it, how the Roman Catholic understand it. So it's about the communication of properties or attributes. So you can say that God suffered, even though deity doesn't really suffer, but his humanity suffered.
The transference of that.
Yeah.
From humanity to deity.
That's where I'm kind of trying to pick up on is whether or not it's the transference or whether or not it's the attribution of because of the two natures being connected. And the reason why I say that, and I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this, but going through his humanity and his divinity. So the Chalcedonian definition, and I'll probably end up reading that. I know it's lengthy, but I think it's worth noting.
Yeah.
But for example, have you ever heard of Mary being called the Theotokos?
That's a new one to me.
Okay. So I think it was, I don't remember if it was the Council of Ephesus. I'm not entirely sure where it was at, but basically it was a term that was brought about in kind of, if I had to take a guess, probably somewhere between the 600s and 800s.
Okay.
But basically it was a definition or a term rather that they gave to Mary. the mother of Christ. And so basically it means God bearer. And I think that that's where you get some of the confusion, or I think it can be a misleading term. Not that I have any issue with the term itself. And the reason why I say that is because I think some people can take it to mean, like, in your mind, when you think of the mother of God, you would think of God himself, like as in his being, as in his substance.
Right.
So you would think that in some way, I could see how some people think it might imply that she had something to do with his divinity. And that's not true. It's just that she gave birth to God the Son in his flesh,
Right.
and his flesh was united to his divinity. So there's a distinction there. And I think it's, and I don't want to undervalue Mary. I do think that there maybe are certain Protestant denominations that might, in me as a Protestant myself, like, I do think that there's sometimes extremes, but I think that that's why you kind of see, and, I think you maybe see it a little bit more prevalent in South American countries where it almost seems like there's this deification of Mary.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it has a little bit to do with kind of that term and kind of that understanding, or that misunderstanding, I guess, about her role in who Christ is.
Yeah. I mean, for me, when I see that, just culturally, I see it as a celebration of the entry point, right? So that's where he came to earth in order for this all to start.
Yeah.
So having that power to be able to provide access to this world, I think maybe that's one of the more important parts of that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely, it's an area I would like to dive deeper more into, because there's a lot to be said and a lot to kind of unpack when it comes to who she was and some of the attributes that are ascribed to her, such as whether or not she was a virgin the rest of her life, whether or not she was completely sinless or free from original sin versus actual sin. But yeah, there's a lot there. But so hopping over to, or I guess I should say, rather, continuing on his human nature. So there's a couple of points too I'd like to bring up before I read the Chalcedonian definition. It's that, so Christ in his human nature, he thirsted and hungered. And as we understand it, that deity doesn't do that.
Right.
God he doesn't get hungry. He doesn't get thirsty.
Right.
That's not something that is ascribable to him. Same thing with his divinity. His divinity is omnipresent. So that means, everywhere at once. There's also the term ubiquity. I think ubiquity is another term for omnipresence. But basically, his human nature retains its attributes. So his human nature cannot be everywhere at once. I'm just trying to think through this, because it's a lot to think about.
That's a mind melter right there, right?
Yeah. Because if you think about it, well, you're not trying to limit his deity because his deity is omnipresent, or, him being God is omnipresent. But Christ in his person, since he's both united to his, a human nature and a divine nature. And this is where the Chalcedonian definition comes in handy and kind of gives us some guardrails. So I'll just read it here, and then we'll kind of discuss it. So, following then the Holy Fathers, we all unanimously teach that our Lord Jesus Christ is to us one and the same Son, the selfsame perfect in the selfsame perfect in Godhead, the selfsame perfect in manhood, truly God and truly man, the selfsame of a rational soul and body, coessential with the Father according to the Godhead, the selfsame coessential with us according to the manhood, like us in all things, sin apart, before the ages begotten of the Father as to the Godhead, but in the last days the selfsame for us and for our salvation, born of the Virgin Mary, Theotokos, as to the manhood, one and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, acknowledged in two natures, unconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably, the differences of the natures being in no way removed because of the union, but rather the properties of each nature being preserved and both concurring into one person in one hypostasis, not as though he was parted or divided into two persons, but one and the selfsame Son and only begotten God, Word, Lord Jesus Christ, even as from the beginning the prophets have taught concerning him, and as the Lord Jesus Christ himself hath taught us, and as the symbol of the fathers hath handed down to us. Okay, the area I really want to focus on is that, but rather the properties of both natures, the properties of each nature being preserved.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is where...
So if we go back, I said transferring, right, the feelings from one another. It maybe transference isn't the right word. It's the experience, and through the experience of one, it becomes the experience of all, right? So
yeah, so when Christ, after his crucifixion and he's resurrected and has like a glorified body, I guess the question then becomes, are there any attributes that can be ascribed to him once his resurrection takes place? Because obviously if he died, and then he defeats death, and then he's immortal, which I think that is a huge part of, and this is something I think that as human beings we fear the most. I don't know if we fear non-existence the most, or if we fear because as human beings we all fear death,
right?
And I feel like that in Christianity an answer is given to us about the resurrection. And so that shows the importance of the body. This is kind of where I'll touch on annihilationism a little bit, and then we'll hop back to the Chalcedonian definition. But so as I was kind of studying on this, annihilationism is basically where Christians that believe, or maybe non-Christians that believe, that once a person dies, if they're not a believer, they basically cease to exist. So there's no afterlife for them. There's no hell. There's no punishment. I guess the punishment itself is non-existence. You don't have any consciousness anymore. You're just gone.
Right.
Which is more of a, if you think about it, I mean, that's probably more of an atheistic view.
Most definitely.
Yeah, because that's what they would have to believe, because there's nothing else after this world. They don't believe in having a soul.
Right.
So with annihilationism, I did find it interesting to learn about it, just because Christ does say, I give eternal life to my sheep. And so the question is, well, if that's what he gives the elect or his sheep, then what is given the wicked? I think, is it eternal death? Because, I believe in hell, and I definitely believe it's a real place. But I did find that kind of topic just kind of fascinating, because it's actually, I think, more of don't quote me on this, but I think it might be Jehovah's Witnesses that believe in annihilationism. I don't think they're the only ones. This is where that John Stott guy I mentioned, that theologian, he believed it, and I think he might have been evangelical. So what are your thoughts on that? Is that the first time you've heard of that? Or
so I've definitely thought of that, but didn't know the term. So I mean, if you look back in your life, there's a point in your life where you don't have memories, right? And just trying to come to terms with life before or after that is just kind of a weird thing to kind of think of. So to think of perpetual non-existence is just a whole nother thing to contemplate. And as a non-believer, is that an easier out than hell?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, both sound terrible.
Yeah, I know, right?
I mean, I guess it's, eternal punishment to me sounds worse, because you're obviously aware that you're being punished and you're aware of the torment. So, it's just kind of a crazy thought to think about, and I do believe that Christ does speak on hell. And I do think that, I think a lot of times people don't think about our sinfulness. And I mean, I think that all just more brings to light his love, because it's like, well, he didn't have to save any of us. He could have saved none of us.
Right.
And so it's like when you really truly think about our own sinfulness, when you look inwardly, it does still amaze me. I think that this is a Spurgeon quote comes to mind where he talks about how, and I know that he's not the only theologian that's kind of made a similar statement, but basically that, when people have trouble understanding why God hated Esau, and he's like, well, I don't have trouble with understanding why God hated Esau. I have trouble understanding why God loved Jacob.
Right.
And I think that that's kind of a good way to put it. Mm-hmm. But going back to the Chalcedonian definition, I think it gets confusing very quickly about how we attribute some of these things. Like is it correct to say that God himself is sorrowful when that's an attribute of humanity?
Right.
Same thing with Christ in his humanity. Can we say it has ubiquity when that's an attribute of divinity? Mm-hmm. And so you get into a whole slew of questions there, because you have the Lord's Supper being one of them, with the Eucharist, obviously. Mm-hmm. That's a lot to think about, because there's, a lot of denominations that believe that Christ is present in the Eucharist, mm-hmm. literally.
Right.
And so that would be his actual body soul, right. Humanity, everything. So there's just a lot of questions that arise to this. And obviously, I'm not trying to pick on Roman Catholics here, because Anglicanism, Lutheranism, they all believe some form of real presence. And I'll probably have a separate episode about the Eucharist, because I think that that's a fascinating topic. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of crazy that, how many different interpretations that Christian denominations have of that subject.
Oh, yeah.
Of that sacrament.
Mm-hmm.
So, but did you have anything else you wanted to touch on?
Yeah, I think one other thing I wanted to touch base on is just from the B.B. Warfield book too.
Yeah.
He said in there that he had to get to the point of extreme, divine anger in order to be able to be merciful, right? And it's the difference between tolerance and mercy. Yeah. So being able to fully understand the reasons behind the emotions, if Jesus wasn't able to experience that, we wouldn't have known that he was being merciful. It could have just been tolerant of behavior, right? So just being able to understand the extremes and understanding that it's not just Jesus experiencing that, but God as well. So through Jesus's experience, we know that God's going to provide us mercy as well. So I think that's something that's powerful that's related to this.
Yeah, totally agree. His compassion and his mercy is something that definitely stands out in his life, right. and his expressed emotions. Mm-hmm. Because there's so many times that people come up to him and, they might not deserve compassion, and yet he has compassion on them. Like the adulterer that, was going to be stoned, mm-hmm. He could have chosen to do nothing, mm-hmm. but instead that, he didn't stop them with violence. He stopped them with his words. Right. It's kind of crazy that he had that power. And, but just being able to show that compassion, to sinners, and that's what he says, I have not come to save the righteous. It's not the well that are in need of a physician, but the sick.
Right.
So, but, I did want to end on, this quote it's a Warfield quote, and I think you'll like it. So he says about, the glory of the incarnation is that it presents to our adoring gaze not a humanized God or a deified man, but a true God-man. Mm. I think he accurately captures both natures perfectly united. He's not a man that became God, so he's not a deified man, and he's not a humanized God, but a true God-man. Mm. So
that's powerful.
It is.
Right.
But yeah, I want to thank our listeners, and I want to thank you for joining me today. It was a good conversation. Hopefully it wasn't, hopefully it wasn't too all over the place, but there's a lot of meat there to go through.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'll for sure be reading the Bible a little bit differently just thinking about this conversation. So
yeah.
I appreciate you having me on here. It's been great to talk to you about all this today.
Yeah, totally agree. Thanks. We'll have to have you on again.
That'd be great.